Christmas Eve was supposed to be easy. That was the lie I told myself as I pulled into the parking lot of my dad's restaurant in Aspen, the kind of place with reclaimed wood walls, dim amber lighting, and menus that don't list prices. Snow was falling in that perfect, cinematic way, and for a brief moment I let myself believe that this year would be different. I had Mason bundled up in his little red coat, his cheeks pink from the cold, his hand tucked into mine as we walked inside. He was 6, excited in that quiet, observant way, taking in the massive Christmas tree that dominated the center of the dining room, easily 12 feet tall, drenched in white lights and fragile glass ornaments that probably cost more than my car payment. My dad had built this place after he remarried Janet. Upscale bistro was the phrase he liked to use, always with pride, always followed by a comment about how lucky he was to have reinvented himself. Janet floated through the room like she owned it, which she did in every way that mattered. Perfect hair, perfectly timed smile, the kind that never quite reached her eyes. Brooke, my half-sister, was already there with her kids, clustered close to Janet like satellites. They were dressed head to toe in matching holiday outfits, coordinated down to the shoes, while Mason and I stood there shaking snow off our coats, clearly not part of the picture she had arranged in her head. Mason drifted a little closer to the tree, not touching it, just staring at the lights and the ornaments spinning slowly from the air currents of people moving past. I was talking to my dad, Carl, who had a drink in his hand already despite it not even being dinner yet. He leaned in for a stiff hug, asked how the drive was, nodded at Mason without really looking at him. I remember thinking that Mason was being unusually quiet, that he sensed something was off, even if he couldn't name it. It happened fast, but not so fast that I missed it. Janet stepped toward Mason, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. There was no warning, no sharp word beforehand, just a sudden movement. She put her hand on my son's shoulder and shoved him hard. Not a nudge, not a guiding touch, but a full, deliberate push that sent his small body stumbling backward into the Christmas tree. The impact made a sound I will never forget, a violent crashing noise as branches snapped and ornaments shattered. Glass exploded around him, pieces flying like shrapnel, lights flickering as the tree swayed dangerously. Mason screamed. Not a tantrum scream, but pure fear, the kind that rips out of a child when they don't understand why the world just turned against them. He fell to the floor tangled in branches, crying and trying to cover his face as shards of glass rained down around him. For a split second the entire restaurant went silent, every conversation dying mid-sentence, forks frozen halfway to mouths. Janet didn't rush to help him. She didn't even look surprised. She straightened her blouse and said, loud enough for several tables to hear, that he needed to make room for the real grandson. Then she waved Brooke's kids forward, ushering them toward the tree like this was some kind of planned photo op that had merely required a small correction. Her voice was calm, annoyed even, as if Mason had been an inconvenient chair she'd moved aside. I was already moving, dropping to my knees, pulling Mason into my arms, checking his face, his hands, his hair for blood. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely tell what I was touching. He was sobbing against my chest, repeating that it hurt, that he was scared, that the tree fell on him. Glass crunched under my knees as I held him, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it was trying to escape my ribcage. I looked up at my dad, expecting something, anything. Anger. Shock. An apology. He was standing exactly where he had been before, drink still in his hand, ice clinking softly as he shifted his weight. His expression was annoyed, not at Janet, not at what had happened, but at me. When I said his name, my voice breaking, he sighed and told me I was being dramatic. He said it was an accident, that Mason shouldn't have been so close to the tree, that Janet didn't mean it like that. He said it was Christmas Eve and I was making a scene. People were staring. A server hovered nearby, clearly unsure what to do. Brooke avoided my eyes, focused instead on adjusting her kids' collars, whispering to them like nothing had happened. Janet stood there with her arms crossed, lips pressed thin, watching me like I had personally ruined her evening. As I carried Mason out of the restaurant, Glass still clinging to his coat, I could hear the murmur of conversation slowly returning behind me, the spell broken, the moment already being rewritten into something more convenient for everyone else. Mason clung to me, his small body trembling, and all I could think was how clear it suddenly was where we stood in that family, how easily my son had been reduced to an obstacle to be shoved aside. The drive home felt endless, even though the road from Aspen to where we were staying wasn't that long. Jason didn't say a word as he pulled the car out of the parking lot, his jaw set tight, both hands gripping the steering wheel like if he loosened his grip even slightly something worse might happen. The snow kept falling, thick and quiet, muffling the world outside, turning everything into a blur of white and yellow street lights. Inside the car, though, there was nothing soft or peaceful about it. The silence was heavy, broken only by the sound of Mason crying in the back seat. He was curled into himself, clutching his plush reindeer so tightly its fabric was already damp from his tears. His sobs weren't loud anymore, just these broken, hitching sounds that came from deep in his chest, like he was trying to hold it together and failing over and over again. Every few seconds he would sniff hard, whispering that it hurt or that he didn't like Grandma Janet, his small voice cracking on the words. I twisted around in my seat more than once, reaching back to touch his knee or his arm, just to remind him I was there, that he wasn't alone, even though it felt like the world had proven otherwise that night. Jason's knuckles were white. I could see them even in the dim light from the dashboard. He hadn't exploded back at the restaurant, hadn't yelled or caused a scene, but I knew him well enough to recognize the kind of anger that goes quiet instead of loud. It was the kind that settles in your bones, the kind that doesn't burn out quickly. He had carried Mason to the car without saying a word to anyone, his face unreadable, his body rigid. Now that same tension filled the space between us, thick and unspoken. I stared out the window, watching snowflakes streak sideways as the car moved, my reflection faintly visible in the glass. My face looked strange to me, like I was seeing someone else, someone older, harder. My heart felt split clean down the middle, one side still racing with rage, the other painfully clear. The rage came in waves, sharp and sudden, replaying the image of Janet's hand on my son's shoulder, the shove, the sound of glass breaking, Mason's scream. Every time the memory surfaced, my chest tightened, my teeth clenched, my hands curled into fists in my lap. But beneath that anger was something colder and steadier. Clarity. The kind that doesn't shout, that doesn't need dramatics, because it's undeniable. My stepmother hadn't just lost her temper or acted without thinking. She had made a choice. She had looked at my child and decided he was expendable, something to be moved out of the way to preserve her picture-perfect moment. And my father had made his own choice by standing there with his drink, dismissing me, minimizing what had happened like my son's pain was an inconvenience. It wasn't just Janet. It was Brooke not saying a word, not even checking on Mason, just ushering her kids forward like this was all normal. It was the staff who froze and then went back to work. It was the entire room full of people who watched a 6-year-old get shoved into a Christmas tree and then accepted the version of events that made their evening easier. As the car moved farther away from the restaurant, I felt something inside me settle into place, like a door quietly closing. Mason sniffled again, his voice small as he asked if we were going home. I told him yes, that we were safe now, that he didn't do anything wrong. Saying the words out loud almost broke me, because I realized how desperately he needed to hear them. He needed to know that what happened wasn't his fault, that he hadn't deserved it, that adults were supposed to protect him and that someone had failed him tonight. Jason finally spoke, his voice low and tight, saying he was sorry I had to see that, sorry Mason had to experience it. He didn't say my dad's name or Janet's, and I was grateful for that. I wasn't ready to hear them spoken out loud. I just nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat, my eyes still fixed on the dark road ahead. As the miles passed, the anger didn't fade, but it changed shape. It became resolve. I knew, with a certainty that surprised me, that nothing would ever be the same after this. Not holidays, not family dinners, not the way I explained my childhood or my father to my own child. Lines had been crossed that couldn't be uncrossed, and pretending otherwise would mean accepting that my son's safety and dignity were negotiable. By the time we pulled into the driveway, Mason's cries had softened into exhausted whimpers, his reindeer still clutched against his chest. I took a deep breath before turning around to get him out of the car, bracing myself not just for the rest of the night, but for everything that would come after. Because somewhere between that restaurant and the quiet road home, I understood something with painful clarity. Family isn't defined by blood or tradition, but by who stands up when it matters, and tonight, the people who were supposed to stand with us had shown exactly who they were. A week had passed since Christmas Eve, but it still felt like I was living inside the aftermath of an explosion. Mason's bruises were fading from deep purples and blues into sickly yellows, but every time I helped him change his shirt or gently cleaned the small cuts on his arms, my chest tightened all over again. He flinched when people moved too fast around him, stuck closer to me than usual, and slept with his bedroom light on every night. I moved through my days on autopilot, functioning but not fully present, my thoughts constantly circling back to that moment in the restaurant and everything it revealed. I was sitting at the kitchen table when my phone buzzed. Mason was coloring nearby, humming softly to himself, his plush reindeer propped up beside him like a guard. I glanced down, expecting a delivery notification or a message from Jason, but instead I saw a group text with names I hadn't muted yet out of some lingering sense of obligation. Janet had created it. My stomach dropped before I even opened the message, my body reacting faster than my mind. The first thing I saw was a link. A bridal boutique website loaded with glossy photos of a wedding gown so extravagant it barely looked real. Layers of silk and lace, hand-beaded details, a dramatic train that would probably require its own handler. Beneath the link, Janet had written that Brooke had found the perfect dress but needed help covering the cost. She included the price like it was an afterthought, $10,000, followed by a smiley face that made my skin crawl. Then came the explanation, if you could call it that. Janet wrote that since I had ruined the family Christmas photo by overreacting and leaving, it was only fair that I contribute something meaningful to make things right. Brooke chimed in a moment later, saying that the photo would have been perfect if I hadn't caused a scene and that this was a chance for me to show that I still cared about the family. My dad didn't write anything at all, but I could see that he had read the messages. His silence felt louder than anything they could have said. I stared at my phone, rereading the messages slowly, making sure I wasn't misunderstanding them. My hands started to shake, not with shock this time, but with a cold, steady anger that felt almost calm. While I was still tending to my child's injuries, while my son was still waking up from nightmares and asking why Grandma Janet didn't like him, they were asking me for money. Not to apologize, not to acknowledge what had happened, not even to pretend to care about Mason, but to compensate them for a photograph that didn't turn out the way they wanted. The sheer audacity of it was almost impressive. In their version of reality, a shattered ornament-strewn floor and a terrified child were less important than an aesthetic moment lost. My son being shoved into a Christmas tree had been reduced to an inconvenience, and now they wanted to invoice me for it. I felt something inside me finally snap into place, the last fragile thread of guilt or obligation breaking cleanly. I looked over at Mason, at the careful way he was coloring inside the lines, his tongue poking out slightly in concentration, unaware of the conversation unfolding on my phone. I thought about the way he had screamed, the way he clung to me in the car, the way my father had dismissed it all with a drink still in his hand. And I realized that there was nothing left to negotiate here. I didn't type back right away. I didn't argue or explain or defend myself. I opened my banking app, entered the smallest amount it would allow me to send, and transferred $1. Then I went back to the group text and wrote a single sentence. I told them to buy a scarf to hide their shame. I hit send before I could second-guess myself, before the old reflex to smooth things over could kick in. The typing bubbles appeared almost immediately, then disappeared, then reappeared again, but I didn't wait to see what came next. I muted the conversation and set my phone face down on the table. For the first time since that night in Aspen, my chest felt lighter. Not because the situation was resolved, but because I had finally stopped pretending it could be. The dollar didn't just land, it detonated. I felt it almost immediately, my phone lighting up again and again like something had gone wrong with it. Carl was the first. He didn't text. He called, over and over, leaving voicemails that grew more unhinged with each one. In the first message his voice was tight and controlled, telling me I had embarrassed him, that I was acting childish and vindictive, that this wasn't how family handled disagreements. By the third voicemail, the control was gone. He was shouting, slurring slightly, accusing me of poisoning everyone against him, of holding grudges, of being just like my mother. He demanded I call him back, demanded I fix what I had broken, demanded I send the real money and apologize to Janet and Brooke for humiliating them. I listened to exactly one of the messages all the way through, then stopped. Not because it hurt too much, but because it confirmed everything I already knew. Not once did he mention Mason. Not once did he ask how his grandson was doing, whether he was healing, whether he was afraid. The only injury that mattered to Carl was his pride. Brooke went a different route. Within hours, she took it public. I found out not because I was looking, but because a friend sent me a screenshot with a short message asking if I was okay. Brooke had written a long, emotional post filled with carefully chosen words and filtered photos. She talked about how hard wedding planning was, how family support meant everything to her, how some people couldn't stand to see others happy. She didn't name me directly, but she didn't have to. She framed herself as the victim of a jealous sister who had always resented her, someone bitter and cruel who lashed out during the holidays and then mocked her dreams. The comments poured in beneath her post. People I didn't know, people who knew only the version of events she fed them, tearing into me with enthusiasm. They called me selfish, unstable, toxic. They said I was clearly obsessed with her, that I needed therapy, that I should be ashamed of myself. Some speculated about my marriage, my parenting, my mental health. Others congratulated Brooke on staying strong and cutting negativity out of her life. Watching strangers dissect my character based on a lie was surreal, like reading about someone else entirely. Janet didn't post. She didn't need to. She worked behind the scenes, forwarding messages, whispering her version of the story into the right ears. I could feel her fingerprints on the way the narrative spread, polished and passive-aggressive, painting me as the problem without ever acknowledging what she had done. Mutual acquaintances stopped responding to my messages. A few unfollowed me quietly. Others watched without saying anything at all. Through all of it, I stayed silent. I didn't comment on Brooke's post. I didn't defend myself. I didn't correct the record or explain what really happened that night in Aspen. Every instinct I had told me to scream the truth, to post photos of Mason's bruises, to lay out every detail and let the evidence speak for itself. But I didn't. Silence wasn't weakness this time. It was restraint. At home, life moved in smaller, more important rhythms. Mason laughed a little more each day. The bruises faded. The cuts healed. He still slept with the light on, but he slept. Jason checked in on me constantly, not with questions, but with presence, a hand on my back, a quiet look that said he understood why I was holding back. I told him everything I was seeing, every voicemail, every screenshot, and he never once suggested I respond. The noise outside grew louder, then uglier, and then, slowly, repetitive. Accusations recycled themselves. Anger burned hot and fast and began to consume itself. I watched it all from a distance, my phone mostly turned face down, notifications muted, my energy conserved. They wanted a reaction. They wanted me frantic, defensive, scrambling to explain myself. I gave them nothing. Because while they were shouting, posting, calling, and spiraling, I was thinking. I was remembering. I was organizing things in my mind with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. I replayed that night again, not emotionally this time, but precisely. Who stood where? Who said what? Who stayed silent? Patterns that I had ignored for most of my life suddenly lined up too neatly to deny. I didn't need to announce what I knew or what I intended to do. I didn't need to threaten or warn anyone. Let them believe I was cornered, embarrassed, overwhelmed. Let them think the silence meant I had nothing to say. I had already said what I needed to with that single dollar. I stayed quiet because I had a plan, and for once, it wasn't about keeping the peace or making myself smaller so others could stay comfortable. It was about protecting my child, reclaiming my voice on my own terms, and making sure that whatever came next would be grounded in truth, not noise. The discovery didn't come from anger or revenge, but from necessity. I had reached a point where I needed answers, not closure, not apologies, but facts. Jason and I were going through the last remaining boxes of my mother's things, the ones my father had dropped off years ago with a casual comment about how I might want them someday. They had been sitting untouched in our storage room, sealed up with brittle tape, smelling faintly of dust and old paper. I hadn't been ready before. After everything that had happened, I finally was. We spread the contents out across the dining table late one evening after Mason had gone to bed. Old letters, photographs, handwritten notes, tax documents, and neatly labeled folders filled with my mother's precise handwriting. She had always been organized, methodical in a way my father never was, and seeing that familiar order made my throat tighten. Jason sat quietly beside me, reading when I handed him things, letting me take the lead. That was when I found the ledger. It was tucked inside a plain folder marked with nothing more than a date range from years before my mother died. At first, I assumed it was another household record, maybe investments or savings. but as I flipped through the pages, my breath caught. The entries were careful and deliberate, listing deposits, account numbers, and notes written in my mother's hand. One phrase appeared again and again, underlined in ink that had slightly faded with time. Trust for first grandchild. I felt cold all over. Mason was the first grandchild. There was no ambiguity there. Brooke's kids were born years later. Jason leaned closer as I read aloud, my voice unsteady. The ledger detailed a trust fund my mother had set up long before she got sick, funded steadily over time, intended specifically for her first grandchild's future. Education, housing, security. It was all there, laid out clearly, with instructions and signatures. And then, abruptly, the entry stopped. The last note was dated shortly before my mother died. It mentioned that Carl had been given temporary oversight until the trust could be formally transferred. Temporary. My hands were shaking now as I turned the pages again, searching for something that explained where it went. There was nothing. No transfer confirmation. No closure. Just silence. Jason didn't say anything at first. He didn't need to. The implication hung heavy in the air between us. My father had never mentioned this trust. Not when Mason was born. Not when we struggled. Not ever. He had hidden it. And if he had hidden this, what else had he buried? That question pushed us further. We started cross-referencing documents, comparing dates, following paper trails my mother had unknowingly left behind. It took hours, then days, of careful reading and quiet concentration. Jason pulled public records, business filings, anything he could access legally. What we found next made the betrayal feel even deeper. There were irregular transfers connected to the restaurant. Large sums, far beyond normal operating expenses, moving out in patterns that didn't make sense. The destination was a company listed under Brooke's name. On paper, it was a consulting business. In reality, it barely existed. No staff. No real services. No legitimate output that justified the hundreds of thousands of dollars being funneled into it over time. The realization settled slowly, like poison. My father hadn't just hidden my son's trust fund. He had been siphoning money from the restaurant, money he claimed didn't exist when it came to helping us, and redirecting it to Brooke through a shell company. It explained everything. The lifestyle. The way money always seemed tight when I asked for help, yet endless when it came to Brooke. The entitlement. The confidence with which they demanded $10,000 from me, as if it were nothing. I felt sick, but not surprised. That was the part that hurt the most. Somewhere deep down, I had always known he was capable of this. Seeing it laid out in black and white removed any remaining doubt. This wasn't favoritism or neglect. This was deliberate theft, calculated and ongoing, at the expense of my child. Jason closed the laptop slowly and looked at me, his expression steady and resolved. There was no panic in his eyes, no rush to act. Just certainty. We had proof. Not assumptions. Not emotions. Proof. I gathered the papers carefully, stacking them back into neat piles, my mother's handwriting staring back at me like a quiet witness. She had tried to protect her grandchild even before he was born. She had trusted the wrong person to carry that out. Sitting there in the quiet of our home, surrounded by the truth my father had worked so hard to hide, I understood something with painful clarity. What had started as cruelty and arrogance had uncovered something far bigger, something they never expected me to find. The meeting with Uncle Phil happened quietly, without drama or confrontation, which somehow made it feel heavier. We chose a small cafe on the edge of town, nothing like my father's restaurant, just worn wooden tables, chipped mugs, and a kind of anonymity that felt intentional. Phil was already there when Jason and I arrived, sitting with his back to the wall out of habit, a man who had learned the hard way how quickly loyalty could be punished. He looked older than I remembered, thinner, his hair more gray than not, but his eyes were sharp and steady when he saw me. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. After a brief hug that felt more like an apology than a greeting, he reached into his bag and pulled out a thick envelope. His hand shook slightly as he set it on the table between us, not from fear, but from something closer to vindication. He told me he had been waiting for this moment, waiting for someone to finally ask the right questions. When Janet fired him from the restaurant years ago, claiming restructuring and loyalty issues, he had known something was wrong. He had just never expected it to go this far. Inside the envelope were copies of contracts, ownership agreements, handwritten amendments, and legal filings I had never seen before. As I read, my pulse quickened. There it was, unmistakable and undeniable. A clause my mother had insisted on when the business was first established, written into the foundation of the company itself. 40% ownership, transferred to me upon her death. Not symbolic. Not conditional. Legally binding. My name was right there, typed clearly, no ambiguity, no room for interpretation. Phil watched my face as the realization hit, nodding slowly. He explained that my mother had been meticulous, that she had anticipated exactly this kind of erasure, and that she had refused to sign off on the final version of the paperwork until the clause was included. She wanted to make sure I was protected, that I could never be fully shut out. After she died, things changed quickly. Janet took control of the administrative side. Carl stopped asking questions. Documents were revised. Originals disappeared. Then Phil showed me the comparison pages. Side-by-side copies of my mother's signature. One genuine, fluid, and consistent. The other stiff, uneven, wrong. Someone had tried to replicate it and failed. They had forged her name to remove me from the ownership structure, altering records, and filing them as if nothing had happened. Seeing it in black and white made my stomach drop, not because I doubted it, but because of how casually it had been done. Like erasing me had been just another task on a checklist. Jason leaned in, silent but focused, his legal mind already at work. He asked precise questions, dates, filing locations, witnesses. Phil answered every one without hesitation. He had copies because he had trusted his instincts, because something had felt off, because he didn't believe in destroying records even after being pushed out. He said he always hoped the truth would matter to someone someday. When Jason finally spoke, his voice was calm but absolute. He confirmed what Phil already knew and what I was only just fully absorbing. This wasn't a civil dispute or a misunderstanding. This was felony-level forgery and fraud. Multiple instances. Multiple parties. Intentional and sustained. The kind of crime that doesn't disappear with money or influence once it's exposed properly. I sat back in my chair, the noise of the cafe fading into the background as everything aligned in my mind. The shove. The entitlement. The audacity of demanding money from me while hiding what was already mine. The way my father had dismissed my son, minimized harm, protected appearances at all costs. It wasn't just cruelty or favoritism. It was control, enforced through lies and theft, justified by the belief that I would never push back hard enough to uncover the truth. Phil looked relieved, like a weight he had carried alone for too long had finally shifted. He said he was sorry he hadn't found a way to reach me sooner, that he hadn't known how. I told him it wasn't his fault, and I meant it. My mother had tried to protect me. He had tried to preserve the truth. The failure wasn't theirs. As we left the cafe, documents secured and facts firmly in place, I felt something I hadn't felt since this all began. Not rage. Not grief. Certainty. Everything they had built on deception was standing on borrowed time, and for the first time, I knew exactly where I stood, not just morally, but legally. The ground beneath me was solid, and it had been all along. The first strike wasn't loud, and it wasn't emotional, and it wasn't visible to anyone watching from the outside, which made it exactly right. Jason and I worked late into the nights for days, long after Mason had gone to sleep, the house quiet except for the low hum of the laptop and the soft shuffle of paper. Every document we touched felt heavier than the last, not because it was complicated, but because of what it represented. Years of deception. Years of being quietly erased. Years of theft wrapped in smiles and holiday dinners. We didn't rush. We were methodical. Every forged signature was scanned in high resolution. Every bank transfer was logged, highlighted, and cross-referenced with dates, amounts, and recipient accounts. The trust fund ledger from my mother was included in full, along with her handwritten notes, the original signatures, and the abrupt halt that coincided perfectly with her death. Jason created timelines that showed patterns so clear they were impossible to dismiss. Money leaving the restaurant in steady, unjustified streams. Funds landing in Brooke's so-called company, which existed only on paper. Ownership documents altered after my mother died, my name removed with a forged hand that didn't even bother to be careful. When everything was assembled, Jason asked me what I wanted to call the file. It seemed like a small thing, almost trivial compared to what it contained, but names matter. I thought about my mother, about the way she believed in clarity and records and truth written down so it couldn't be twisted later. I thought about Mason, about what had been taken from him before he was even old enough to understand it existed. I named it sterling truth. Clean. Precise. Impossible to argue with. We sent it out quietly. First to the licensing board that oversaw the restaurant, the same board that took compliance violations and financial misconduct very seriously. Then to the bank that handled the business accounts, complete with evidence of fraudulent transfers and shell company laundering. Finally, to Brooke's fiancé's legal team, not with commentary or accusation, but with facts, documentation, and a clear explanation of how deeply entangled his future was with criminal exposure he likely knew nothing about. I didn't add a personal note. I didn't explain my feelings or justify my actions. I let the evidence speak. Truth doesn't need embellishment when it's this thorough. Once everything was sent, there was nothing left to do but wait. No confrontations. No announcements. No warnings. I resisted the urge to check my phone every few minutes, resisted the urge to imagine their reactions when the emails landed, when the calls started, when the walls they had built began to crack. I had spent too many years reacting to their choices. This time I was done performing. Life at home stayed quiet. Mason laughed more easily now, his fear slowly loosening its grip. Jason moved through the house with a calm confidence, like someone who knew exactly how things would unfold even if he didn't rush them. And me, I felt steady in a way that surprised me. Not triumphant. Not vengeful. Just grounded. They had underestimated me for years. They had mistaken my silence for weakness, my distance for indifference, my restraint for ignorance. Sterling truth sat where it needed to sit now, in the hands of people who dealt in facts and consequences, and there was nothing left for me to say. So we waited, not anxiously, not impatiently, but with the quiet certainty that once the truth is released, it doesn't need help finding its way forward. The crumble didn't happen all at once, but once it started, it was relentless. The first sign came from the bank, quiet but decisive, when they flagged the second mortgage on the restaurant property and froze further movement until an investigation could be completed. That single action rippled outward, stalling payments, triggering reviews, and forcing questions my father had avoided for years. Money that had once moved freely suddenly hit walls, and those walls did not care about charm or excuses. Not long after that, word reached me that Brooke's fiancé had postponed the wedding. There was no announcement, no dramatic explanation, just a sudden shift from certainty to delay. Venues were put on hold. Deposits were questioned. Lawyers stepped in where planners once stood. I imagined the conversations happening behind closed doors, the careful questions, the dawning realization that marrying into that family meant inheriting far more than a last name. Then the restaurant itself went dark. The health department shut it down after inspections uncovered violations that had been ignored or covered up for years. It wasn't one small issue or a technicality, but a pattern of neglect and falsified compliance records that made the closure unavoidable. The same place that had once sparkled with curated elegance now sat empty, chairs stacked, lights off, a notice taped to the door for everyone in town to see. Janet panicked. That much became clear when she tried to wire $200,000 to an account in Florida, a last-ditch attempt to move money out of reach before it could be seized or questioned. The transfer was blocked. Flagged. Logged. Another red mark added to a growing list. Every door she tried to slip through quietly slammed shut instead. Then came the sound I never expected to hear associated with my childhood home. Sirens. Police cars pulling up in broad daylight. Officers moving with purpose, not urgency, the kind that comes from warrants and preparation. They went through the house room by room, carrying boxes out, documenting, sealing evidence. Neighbors watched from their windows. Phones came out. Whispers spread. The illusion of control my father and Janet had clung to for so long dissolved in real time. My phone rang more than once that day, but there was only one call I answered. Jessica was screaming before I could even say hello, her voice shrill and raw, blaming me for everything, accusing me of destroying the family, of being vindictive, of turning everyone against them. She said things she couldn't take back, words fueled by panic and the sudden collapse of a world built on lies. I held the phone away from my ear and listened until she ran out of breath. When I finally spoke, my voice was steady. I told her to stop calling me. Then I hung up. I didn't flinch when the news came in waves. I didn't feel the urge to explain myself or soften the reality of what was happening. This wasn't chaos. This was consequence. Everything unfolding was the direct result of choices they had made, long before I ever sent a dollar or named a file. That night, I sat at the kitchen table long after the house had gone quiet, the same place where I had once tended Mason's bruises and read that first group text. The difference now was clarity. The noise had shifted away from me, finally landing where it belonged. I hadn't pushed anything over. I had simply stopped holding it up. 3 days before what was supposed to be her wedding, Brooke was standing in the middle of the bridal boutique in the dress she had obsessed over for months, surrounded by mirrors and soft lighting that suddenly couldn't soften anything. I know this because Jason and I were called, not invited, but summoned, after every single one of her cards declined at the register. The boutique was the kind of place that smelled like perfume and money, all hushed voices and careful smiles, but that day the atmosphere was tight and brittle. Brooke was crying openly, mascara streaking down her face, one hand clutching the bodice of the gown like it might disappear if she let go, the other shaking as she tried again and again to swipe different cards with the same result. The sales associate had gone from sympathetic to uncomfortable, her tone shifting as she quietly explained that without payment, they couldn't release the dress or continue alterations. Brooke kept insisting there had to be a mistake, that there was plenty of money, that this had never happened before. Her bridesmaids stood nearby in a loose semicircle, murmuring at first, then slowly falling silent as the reality sank in. One by one, they took small steps backward, not dramatically, not cruelly, but instinctively, like people realizing they were too close to something contagious. Jason and I arrived while Brooke was still pleading into her phone, her voice cracking as she demanded someone fix it right now. When she saw me, her expression shifted instantly from panic to fury, like she had found a target solid enough to hit. She screamed my name, accused me of orchestrating it, accused me of ruining her life, her wedding, her future. The entire boutique went quiet. Every mirror reflected the same image of her standing there in a $10,000 dress she no longer had access to, exposed in a way no veil could cover. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't interrupt her. I waited until she ran out of words, until her accusations collapsed into sobs. Then I explained, calmly and clearly, why the accounts were frozen. I told her about the bank investigation, the flagged transfers, the shell company, the forged signatures. I told her that when financial institutions find evidence of fraud, they don't ask permission before locking things down. I didn't gloat. I didn't embellish. I stated facts. The effect was immediate and visible. Her bridesmaids exchanged looks, confusion turning into unease. One of them asked quietly what I meant by forged signatures. Another asked if this was why the wedding had been postponed. No one touched Brooke anymore. No one reached for her hand or offered reassurance. They created space between themselves and her, the kind that doesn't come from judgment but from self-preservation. Then her fiancé arrived. He came in fast, his face tight, phone still in his hand like he had been arguing with someone on the way. He didn't look at the dress first. He looked at Brooke. Then at me. Then at Jason. He asked one question, short and controlled, asking if what I had said was true. Jason answered him, not emotionally, but professionally, explaining the scope of the investigation and what it meant legally. Brooke tried to interrupt, tried to cry and explain and minimize, but he held up his hand to stop her. He didn't yell. He didn't argue. He told her he was done. He said he couldn't marry someone whose life was entangled in fraud and criminal exposure, someone who had lied by omission and expected him to clean up the fallout. He apologized to the staff, handed the sales associate his card to cover the appointment fee, and walked out without another word. Brooke collapsed into sobs after he left, the kind that fold a person inward, but no one rushed to catch her. The dress hung heavy on her frame now, no longer a symbol of celebration, just an expensive costume she couldn't afford to wear. Jason placed a hand lightly on my back, not guiding me, just steadying me, and together we turned and walked out. As the boutique door closed behind us, I felt nothing sharp, nothing triumphant. Just the quiet finality of watching a lie reach the end of its runway, with nowhere left to walk. The collapse came swiftly after that, like the final support beams giving way once the structure could no longer pretend it was stable. Janet was arrested outside the boutique, right there on the sidewalk where she had rushed in after getting Brooke's frantic call, still dressed impeccably, still trying to project control. Police cars pulled up as shoppers passed by pretending not to stare, and officers placed her in handcuffs with practiced efficiency. She argued at first, loudly, insisting there had been a misunderstanding, demanding to know who had authorized this, but none of it mattered anymore. The evidence had already spoken. Carl tried a different approach. He called me from a number I hadn't blocked yet, his voice stripped of the authority he used to wield so easily. He said we didn't need to do this, that things had gone too far, that families handled problems internally. He offered to hand over the company, to sign whatever was needed, to make it right if I would just help make the legal issues go away. He spoke like he was negotiating a business deal, like the years of lies and theft could be erased with a signature and a promise. I listened without interrupting, then told him no. Not because I wanted more, but because what he was offering wasn't his to bargain with anymore. The next morning, they were arraigned. Janet and Carl stood side by side in court, suddenly smaller without their money and influence insulating them. The charges were read out calmly, methodically, each one landing like a weight they couldn't dodge. Embezzlement. Forgery. Grand larceny. Tax fraud. The words echoed in the room, stripped of drama, grounded in fact. There were no speeches, no explanations that mattered, just legal reality setting in. The fallout spread fast. Jessica lost custody of her kids once the full scope of the financial crimes and instability became impossible to ignore. What had been carefully hidden behind curated images and public sympathy collapsed under scrutiny. The same people who once defended them quietly distanced themselves, unwilling to be associated with what was now undeniable. The empire they had built cracked not with a single dramatic explosion, but with a series of clean, irreversible breaks. Accounts frozen. Properties seized. Reputations destroyed. The illusion of untouchability gone. I watched it all from a distance, not detached, but resolved. This wasn't about revenge or victory. It was about truth finally having room to exist without being smothered by money and denial. I thought about my mother, about the safeguards she had tried to put in place, about the cost of trusting the wrong people. I thought about Mason, asleep in his bed that night, safe and unaware of how much had shifted to protect him. The world they controlled no longer existed, and what remained was something far less grand, but far more honest. The takeover wasn't dramatic or loud, but it was definitive. I filed for receivership with the court once the full scope of the financial crimes and ownership fraud had been formally acknowledged, and there was no resistance left that carried any weight. The ruling came back clean and precise, granting me control of the business my mother had helped build and that others had tried so hard to erase me from. Walking into the restaurant again under those circumstances felt strange, like stepping into a familiar room that had been rearranged by strangers and finally set right. One of the first things I did was change the name. The old signage came down quietly in the early morning hours, and when the new one went up, it read Eleanor's Table, simple and unpretentious, exactly like my mother had been. Saying her name out loud in that space felt like reclaiming something sacred, like restoring a heartbeat that had been deliberately ignored for years. Carl's luxury SUV was still sitting in the employee lot, a symbol of excess that had been paid for with stolen money. I sold it without hesitation, and every dollar from that sale went directly into staff raises. I gathered the remaining employees together and told them exactly what was happening, not with corporate language or half-truths, but with honesty. Some of them cried. Others just nodded, relieved. They had known things were wrong long before any of this surfaced, even if they hadn't known how deep it went. We brought back the original recipes next, the ones my mother had written by hand, tucked away and replaced over time with trend-driven plates meant to impress instead of nourish. The food changed the atmosphere almost immediately. Familiar smells filled the kitchen again, grounding and warm, reminding people why they had loved the place in the first place. Regulars returned. Word spread quietly, the way it does when something feels genuine instead of curated. I didn't rebuild the restaurant to prove a point or to chase redemption. I rebuilt it to honor a woman who believed in integrity, who believed that legacy was something you tended carefully, not something you exploited. Every decision I made came back to that. Fair wages. Transparent books. Respect for the people who showed up every day and made the place run. Mason came by one afternoon after school, holding my hand as we walked through the dining room. He asked why Grandma Eleanor's name was on the wall, and I told him the truth, that she had built something good and that we were taking care of it now. He smiled, small and genuine, and in that moment I knew exactly why this mattered. What they had tried to erase didn't just survive. It grew back stronger, rooted in honesty instead of entitlement. Eleanor's Table wasn't just a restaurant anymore. It was a correction. A promise kept. And it was for Mason, so that he would grow up knowing that what is taken through cruelty and lies can be reclaimed through truth and care. The peace did not arrive like a victory lap or some dramatic moment of release, it came quietly and settled in over time, so softly that I almost missed it at first. It showed up in the spaces where anger used to live, in the absence of dread when my phone buzzed, in the way my shoulders finally stopped tensing every time I thought about my last name. Carl called from jail on a gray afternoon when I was reviewing invoices in the office, the restaurant humming steadily around me with the sounds of plates, voices, and life moving forward. His number lit up my screen, unfamiliar and yet instantly recognizable, and for a brief second I just stared at it, noticing how little it stirred in me. There was no spike of fear, no rush of anger, no curiosity. Just emptiness. I imagined him on the other end, rehearsed and desperate, trying to find words that would turn consequence into forgiveness, and I realized I didn't owe him even my silence. I blocked the number and went back to work, the decision feeling as ordinary and necessary as locking a door at night. Jessica's email came days later, long enough after the arrests and court dates that panic had begun to curdle into desperation. The subject line alone was heavy, a plea disguised as concern, and when I opened it, the message unfolded in long paragraphs that circled responsibility without ever landing on it. She wrote about being scared, about how fast everything had fallen apart, about how she never imagined things would go this far. She wrote about her children, about how they missed their old lives, about how family was supposed to be a safety net when everything else failed. She apologized in vague language that avoided names and actions, regret expressed without accountability. I read it all the way through once, then again more slowly, noticing what wasn't there. Mason's name never appeared. Not once. Neither did the word shove, or hurt, or wrong. I didn't reply with anger or explanation. I didn't tell her how many nights Mason had woken up crying, how carefully I had cleaned glass out of his coat, how that one moment had fractured something fundamental. Instead, I attached a single file. The security footage from that night. The camera angle was wide and merciless, capturing the tree, the lights, Mason standing too close but doing nothing wrong, and then Janet stepping forward. You could see the shove clearly, the suddenness of it, the violence of a grown woman pushing a child. You could hear the crash, see the ornaments explode, watch Mason disappear into branches and glass. And then there was the moment that still made my stomach turn every time I saw it, Janet laughing, not nervously or in shock, but with open amusement, as if inconvenience had just been corrected. I sent the video without a single word attached. Truth doesn't need framing when it's that clear. After that, the messages stopped. No more calls. No more emails. No more attempts to rewrite the story. Silence returned, but this time it wasn't the suffocating kind, it was spacious, breathable, honest. Life settled into a new rhythm at the restaurant. Eleanor's table felt different now in ways that had nothing to do with decor or branding. The air was lighter. Staff lingered after shifts instead of rushing out, laughing in the kitchen, sharing meals the way people do when they feel safe. The books were clean. The paychecks were fair. There were no secrets hidden behind closed office doors. I could feel my mother's presence there, not as a ghost, but as a standard, something solid and grounding that informed every choice I made. Mason came with me most afternoons after school, dropping his backpack by the office door before bursting into the dining room like he owned the place. He ran between tables, his laughter ringing out, unrestrained and joyful, stopping to wave at cooks, servers, dishwashers, all of whom greeted him by name. He no longer hugged walls or stayed close to my side. He moved freely, confidently, his body no longer braced for harm. Sometimes he helped roll silverware, sometimes he sat at the counter drawing pictures of the restaurant with Grandma Eleanor's name written proudly at the top in uneven letters. I watched him one evening as he raced past the spot where the old Christmas tree used to stand, the place where everything had broken. He didn't slow down. He didn't look wary. That space held no power over him anymore. Whatever fear had been planted there had been pulled out by its roots and replaced with safety, repetition, and love. Standing there, I understood something with a clarity that felt like peace settling into my bones. Inheritance isn't money or property or control. It isn't trust funds or businesses or last names etched into buildings. It's the emotional landscape we leave our children with. It's whether they feel safe in rooms, whether they trust adults, whether they believe the world will protect them when they are small and vulnerable. Mason will inherit laughter echoing through a restaurant built on honesty. He will inherit a story where cruelty was named and stopped, not excused or buried. He will inherit the knowledge that his worth is non-negotiable, that no one gets to shove him aside and call it acceptable. That is the legacy my mother tried to protect, the one they tried to erase, and the one that survived anyway. That is the only inheritance that matters, and watching my son run freely through a place rebuilt on truth, I know it is one that will last.